As a thick fog blanketed the lonely trails of Oakwood Park, far beyond the reach of any street lamp's glow, a resilient creature moved forward on calloused paws. Dust clung to its back, but its eyes never lost their determination. It was a German shepherd. Collarless, companionless, yet every step it took carried something more than survival, a will that refused to surrender. Its ash-gray coat, once likely sleek and proud, was now matted with cold mud and rain. But its eyes, alert, clear and searching, looked not for food or shelter, but for something more vital. It wasn't simply wandering. It was listening, with a sense honed somewhere between mankind's battlefields and an animal's raw instinct to live. That night, the wind rose from the lake and sliced through the trees like the forest's own weary sighs. Then a strange sound broke through the underbrush, a faint gasp, nearly a dying whisper asking for help. The dog froze. Its pointed ears stood tall like antennas catching the frequency of pain. Slowly, cautiously, it stepped forward, weaving through the undergrowth and swaying in the dim moonlight. And then, it saw her. A young woman lay on her side beneath a great oak, chained to its trunk by a cold steel cable. Her pale skin nearly melted into the gray bark, her tangled hair spread around her like wild grass, and her body trembled with each wave of cold that sliced through her flesh. Her shirt was torn, her legs were bruised, her fingers, purple and curled, clung to the last threads of consciousness. The dog didn't bark. It stood silently, watching her as if trying to understand who she was, where she came from, and why she'd been left here. Then, after a few seconds that seemed to carry the weight of an entire life, it stepped forward and gently touched her hand with its nose, a gesture soft as a whisper from the breathing world. Claire Bennett, 26, didn't open her eyes, but when the dog's nose met her skin, her lips moved ever so slightly. No one could tell what she said, but whatever it was, it found its way to the heart of the four-legged creature beside her. And then, for the first time in its long, silent journey, the dog barked. It rang out, sharp, urgent, cutting through the fog like a flare. It wasn't a bark of threat or warning, but a signal, as if the dog were saying, "I've found her. Is anyone out there? Come, now." It barked again, and again. Each time it was louder, more desperate. Its posture was silent yet unyielding, shielding the unconscious girl from the wind, its eyes never leaving her face, the eyes of a warrior without a battlefield, who had now found a mission worth more than any command from a human. No one knew how far it had traveled, how it had survived, or why it arrived here at the exact moment it was needed. But in that moment, the dog was no longer abandoned. It was a guardian, a flicker of light in suffocating darkness, a hand stretched out from the edge of despair. And when hurried footsteps echoed in the distance, when the breath of someone running toward that bark reached the trees, the dog didn't move. It kept its eyes fixed on the woman it had found in the shadows. The bark echoed through the air like a great crack, splitting the freezing fog that smothered Oakwood Park. Here, the sound was swallowed by thick trees and damp trails few dared to walk. From far off, near the curve of the lake, Emily Hayes, a young social worker out for a morning jog, came to an abrupt stop. Her canvas shoes were soaked from fallen leaves, but she didn't care. There was something in that sound that made her heartbeat skip, then spike with a feeling she couldn't name. She pulled out her earbuds and tilted her head. The bark came again, not the confused yelp of a lost dog, nor a threatening warning. It was a cry, compressed and forceful from somewhere deep, like someone was trying to say, "This matters, please listen." Others might have dismissed it as a wild dog howling in the woods, but Emily, who had spent 5 years working with abused children and survivors of domestic violence, could not ignore the feeling growing inside her. Without hesitation, she turned down a narrow path leading into the thicker forest. Each step is driven by something beyond logic. Then, as she passed through a ring of old oaks with roots like giant arms reaching out from the earth. She stopped cold. In front of her was a scene she could barely believe. Beneath a large tree, cloaked in damp moss, lay a young woman, chained to the trunk with a length of cold metal. Her clothes were torn, her limbs bruised, and her body curled as if trying to shield itself from a bone-deep chill. Her hair was tangled and spread across her face, lips dry and nearly colorless. But what froze Emily wasn't just the woman's broken state. It was the figure standing beside her. A German shepherd, body covered in dust, dried mud, and streaks of old cuts. The dog showed no aggression. It simply stood there, eyes locked on the unconscious woman. Its coat, once likely stunning with the breed's signature gray and black tones, was now dirty and tangled. But its presence was unmistakable. Dignified, calm, alert. The way it stayed close, blocking the wind, guarding her, never moving away, told Emily all she needed to know. It wasn't here by chance. It had found her, and it wasn't going to leave. Emily froze for a second, then dropped to her knees beside Claire. Her hands trembled as she placed 2 fingers on the icy wrist. The pulse was faint, fragile as a thread. She didn't need medical training to know that a few more minutes would have meant the end. A life lost deep in the woods, with no name, no witnesses. Fumbling, she pulled out her phone and called emergency services, her fingers shaking. Meanwhile, the dog barked again, lower this time but clearer. A nudge. "Hurry! She's barely holding on." "It's okay, I'm here," Emily murmured. To herself, to the woman, to the dog. She took off her jacket, gently laid it over the freezing body, and then wrapped her scarf around Claire's hands. The dog watched every move, not with suspicion but with deep, deliberate awareness, as if weighing whether this human could be trusted with what it had protected. At last, the dog stepped closer and softly nudged Claire's hand, an act of gentle care. Emily nearly cried. In all her years in social work, she had seen violence, cruelty, and hopelessness. But never had she seen an animal, abandoned, hurt, and wandering, carry such an intact, selfless heart. As the ambulance finally turned into the main path, its yellow lights cutting through the mist, Emily stood and waved. Then she knelt and whispered to the dog, "You're not going anywhere. He stays. I won't let anyone separate you. I promise." And, strangely, the dog, still unnamed, sat down beside Claire, placing its front paws close to her side as if confirming that her words were true. There was no fear in its eyes. Only one purpose left to fulfill: to protect the woman it had never met but chose not to leave. When the medics rushed over and tried to move the dog away, Emily stepped between them. "Don't! That dog is the reason she's alive." They looked surprised, but when the beam of their flashlight caught the dog's eyes, they understood. This was no ordinary stray. It was the first soul to hear a silent cry for help, the first to believe someone still deserved to be found, and for the first time in years, Emily felt something stir inside her chest: belief. When the ambulance doors closed and the vehicle sped off into the early, not yet bright morning, Emily sat in the back, clutching Claire's cold foot. Beside her, the German shepherd, whose name she still didn't know, lay silently pressed against her, eyes unblinking. It didn't look at anyone, didn't react to the siren, didn't panic in the confined space. It simply stayed close to Claire, as if that was the only place it was allowed to exist. And when the sterile white lights of the hospital replaced the misty shadows of the forest, it was still there. Claire was rushed into the emergency room, where the doctors quickly took over. But only a few hours later, a nurse hurried out to the hallway where Emily waited, worry etched across her face. She's awake, but she's not saying a word. Her mother's inside, but she isn't responding to anything. Emily followed quickly, her heart sinking further with each step. She panics when she sees strangers. Her heart races, breathing irregularly. She avoids eye contact, even with her mother. The door to the room stood slightly ajar. Inside, Amanda, a woman in her early 40s, face haggard with worry, sat beside her daughter, holding her hand. But Claire gently pulled away, her gaze drifting, as if she didn't recognize or couldn't bear to acknowledge her mother's presence. Claire's eyes were open but vacant, and her body flinched every time a nurse approached. No words, no strong movements, just a suffocating tension in the air, thick like fog before a storm. Emily stepped beside Amanda and whispered, "I think I know what might help." And then, when Shadow, that's what Emily had started calling the dog, was gently led in on a soft leash, the room stilled. The dog moved slowly, scanning each face, then headed straight to Claire's bed. No one needed to guide him. He already knew where to go. Claire didn't look up at first, but when Shadow's paws made their soft, familiar sound on the floor near the edge of the bed, her eyes squeezed shut, then opened again, and for the first time since regaining consciousness, she turned her head slowly. Her clouded eyes met Shadow's bright ones. Not a bark, not a sound. The dog simply sat, pressing his body against the bed, lowering his head but keeping his gaze locked on her face. And with that, Claire began to breathe more slowly. Amanda choked back a sob. The doctors exchanged silent glances. No one needed to check her vitals. They could tell her body was stabilizing. Claire stared at Shadow for a long, long time, then slowly let her hand drop toward the edge of the bed. It was unclear what she was reaching for, but in that instant, Shadow's nose met her trembling fingers. Claire immediately gripped them, as if clinging to the only lifeline left in her sea of panic. Emily had to look away, eyes burning. Amanda covered her mouth. The entire room froze in that sacred moment. A woman who had been left behind in the woods was finding life again through the eyes of an unnamed animal. In the days that followed, Claire still didn't speak. Whenever a doctor entered the room, she recoiled, avoiding the light, never answering questions. But if Shadow was there, she remained grounded. They began calling him the only key to the closed-off world she now lived in. A young psychologist named Lara was brought in to support Claire's mental recovery. She quietly observed each session, taking extensive notes. But what truly captured her attention was Shadow's behavior. He responded with remarkable sensitivity to Claire's emotions. When she was anxious, he barked softly, as if to reassure her. When she startled, he moved closer, not touching her, but near enough so she knew she wasn't alone. Most astonishingly, when Lara tested various tones while saying "Claire," Shadow only reacted positively to gentle voices, without command or doubt. Shadow wasn't just a trained dog. He was a being that could discern emotions, sense threat versus safety, and most of all, know exactly who needed him most. One late afternoon, after a full-body scan of Claire, the results stunned the medical team. In addition to the bruises and scrapes from being chained to a tree, Claire bore numerous older injuries: old rib fractures, pooled blood and soft tissue near her hip, and signs of past blunt force trauma left untreated. Lara stared at the scans, a lump in her throat. These wounds weren't from an accident. No one falls the same way repeatedly. No one accidentally inflicts a long scar behind their shoulder. Claire had been abused. Silently, for a very long time. And now she was the only survivor, left with fragments of broken memories that only one being could begin to piece together: Shadow. The moment the scans revealed Claire's old, unexplained injuries, the atmosphere in her hospital room turned heavy. Claire still hadn't spoken a word, but her constant withdrawal, her terrified glances whenever anyone approached, and her unbreakable bond with Shadow spoke volumes. Yet what haunted Emily most was Amanda's expression every time she saw her daughter flinch. It wasn't the heartbreak of a mother realizing her child had endured too much. It was confusion, tinged with impatience. That day, Amanda entered the room with a bouquet of bright flowers and a strained smile. Shadow was lying with his head resting on Claire's legs, eyes instantly alert and trained on the door as soon as he heard Amanda's heels. Claire didn't turn to look at her. Instead, she pulled her hand to her chest and buried her face deeper into Shadow's neck fur, as if seeking shelter. Emily sat quietly in the corner, observing. Amanda sighed, set the flowers down, and turned to Lara. Claire's always been overly sensitive. Even loud noises used to scare her as a kid. I tried everything, but she was always more fragile than other children. And as she got older, she just closed herself off. Maybe all these reactions are just psychological. Her voice was gentle, but it painted Claire's sensitivity as a defect, something broken. Shadow immediately lifted his head, ears sharp, eyes narrowed. He didn't growl or act aggressively, but Emily, who had spent years studying therapy animals, recognized the signal instantly. Shadow didn't trust this woman, and he didn't hide it. Lara tactfully suggested Amanda let Claire rest. Amanda lingered a few minutes more, occasionally placing a hand on Claire's shoulder, whispering things no one else could hear. But whatever she said, each whisper made Claire shrink further, her grip on Shadow's fur tightening like someone clinging to the last lifeline in a rising tide. Later that afternoon, just after the rain broke and sunlight began peeking through, Ryan, the stepfather Amanda had mentioned a few times, arrived at the hospital. He wore a dark suit, a perfectly folded pocket square, and cologne so strong it gave Emily a mild headache as he passed in the hallway. From the moment he entered, Ryan didn't ask about her medical condition, didn't ask how she was feeling. He strode directly into the room, sat with quiet authority, and gestured for the nurse to step aside. His voice, perhaps trying to sound soft, still carried an undertone of command. "Claire, you need to talk to the doctor. Everyone's just trying to help. They can't do anything if you stay silent. Do you understand?" Claire didn't look at him. She curled tighter into Shadow, nearly disappearing behind his large body. But then something happened. Shadow growled. Not loud, not aggressive, but now from deep in his throat, clear and unmistakable, a warning. "Stop." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "Who let this dog in here?" Emily's voice came from behind, calm but firm. "I did. He's the reason Claire is still alive. He hasn't left her side since we found her in the park. He's the only thing keeping her calm." Ryan opened his mouth to reply, but paused at Shadow's steady, unblinking stare. And Emily saw it, the flicker of discomfort. Not from the dog itself, but from something Ryan couldn't control. That night, Emily sat in the nurse's lounge with her notebook open. Officially, she was brought in as temporary psychological support, but her instincts and years working with survivors of abuse told her something wasn't right. A woman chained in a public park during winter, left to die. No robbery, no assault, but many old injuries. And that stepfather, along with a mother who either couldn't see the truth or chose not to. She glanced through the glass into Claire's room. Shadow lay on the floor, head resting on Claire's legs. His eyes are still open. He wasn't sleeping. He was standing guard, and that watchfulness spoke louder than any testimony. Emily drew a deep breath. Claire might not be able to speak yet, but she wasn't alone. The darkness behind that door wouldn't consume her, so long as that gaze remained beside her. A gaze that had not once looked away since the very first moment in the woods. Emily barely slept that night. The image of Ryan, the composed stepfather with unreadable eyes, kept replaying in her mind, along with the low, rumbling growl from Shadow echoing in her ears like an alarm bell. No dog growls like that out of instinct alone. That sound came from memory, a reflex born of experience. Shadow had seen something in Ryan that humans hadn't yet recognized. The next morning, while Claire was temporarily moved to a quieter area for observation, Emily took the chance to get Shadow checked. No one knew anything concrete about him, only that he had emerged from the darkness and hadn't left Claire's side since. But in his eyes, in the way he moved, observed, and reacted, Emily saw the signs of training. She brought him to the hospital's veterinary unit for a chip scan. The young vet raised an eyebrow as the scanner beeped. "There's a chip, a special type, used in K9 units or advanced working dog programs. One moment, please." Emily stood with her hand resting gently on Shadow's back, The dog remained still, entirely unbothered. He didn't look at the vet. Instead, his eyes stayed on the door, as if instinct told him something important was near. A few minutes later, the vet returned holding a printout. Registered name? Shadow. Breed? Black German Shepherd. Male, born in 2020, trained in a state-run K9 program. Last registered handler? Marcus Reilly. The name meant nothing at first. But when Emily searched through the specialized law enforcement database, the results made her freeze. Marcus Reilly, former K9 trainer for the Halston County Police Department, was discharged from the force 3 years ago after an internal incident. The report lacked details and was red only. Loss of control during training, resulting in permanent deactivation of K9. Trainer resigned voluntarily. Emily reread the line 3 times. Too vague, too carefully worded. But what caught her attention most was the final note on the file. Dog Shadow did not complete full training, deemed unsuitable for duty due to refusal to follow aggressive commands, but demonstrated exceptional ability to protect vulnerable subjects. Her heartbeat quickened. She crouched to meet Shadow's steady, jet-black eyes. "You didn't fail," she whispered. "You just refused to harm, and now you've come back. In your way." On the drive back to the hospital, Emily said nothing. Pieces were starting to fit together. A dog dismissed for not attacking the weak. A handler who quietly resigned after a concealed incident. A girl chained in a park, covered in old injuries, and only calm in the presence of that same dog. Shadow hadn't appeared by accident. He hadn't just wandered into Oakwood Park that day. He had returned to finish something left undone, either by instinct or by an unbreakable bond with a human soul. Emily looked at Shadow, sitting in the passenger seat. Sunlight glinted off his back, his coat gleaming black like midnight. But in his eyes, there was a strange clarity, as if Shadow didn't need to be guided. He was the guide. Back at the hospital, Claire was undergoing another session with Laura. Emily stood outside the observation window, watching. Claire still didn't speak, but she allowed Shadow to rest right beside her. Her hand gently stroked his chest, eyes still cloudy but less tremulous. Emily entered quietly, placed the printout on the table before Laura, and whispered, "We're not just looking at a rescue dog. We're looking at a soldier who never abandoned his mission." For the first time, Laura was silent for a long while before nodding. "Then let him keep fighting, in the way he chooses." From the day Shadow appeared beside Claire's hospital bed, the building felt like a different place. No longer just a corridor soaked in antiseptic and the urgent footsteps of nurses. It became a space where something was slowly, quietly being reborn. Fragile, wordless, but unmistakably alive. Claire didn't speak, but she began to draw. No one told her to. Laura, the kind and intuitive psychologist, had simply left a set of watercolors and blank sheets by the windowsill, as if leaving a door ajar for someone trapped in darkness to step through. And Claire did, one trembling fingertip at a time, through the slow, deliberate motion of a paintbrush. The first day, she painted a room with no windows, stained gray walls, empty yet echoing. On the second day, she drew a blurred figure, faceless, dragging a chain across cold cement. On the third day, she stared at the paper for a long while, then suddenly painted an antique wristwatch on the left wrist of the shadowy figure, painstakingly detailed, disturbingly precise. The hands read 417. No one knew why. But for Claire, every number cut like a blade across her dreams. Emily was the first to notice something deeper. Years of working in trauma recovery had taught her this. Real pain rarely comes in screams. It comes in sideways glances or a trembling line on paper. And this time, she sensed a deeper layer of memory surfacing. Not in conversation, but in muted, melancholic colors. Shadow seemed to understand, too. Whenever Claire drew something especially painful, a heavy cellar door, a crimson rope dangling from the ceiling, he didn't look away. No barking, no growling. Just a quiet presence, his chin resting on her knee as if to say, no matter how dark the memory, you're not alone. And sometimes, when Claire painted the darkest lines, her tears would fall on the paper, and Shadow would gently lick her wrist, slowly, softly, as if wiping away a sorrow too deep for words. Emily couldn't stay passive. She decided to bring the drawings to Helen Marlowe, a seasoned art therapist who had helped countless trauma survivors find their voice through images. As Helen unfolded each page, the room fell silent. The woman in her 60s, silver-haired and eyes sharpened by a lifetime of seeing too much, lingered longest on the fourth drawing, the only one where Claire used red, a noose tightening around a blurred wrist just beneath the familiar wristwatch. "She's not just remembering," Helen whispered. "She's a warning. That's the voice of someone who can't scream." Emily's throat tightened. She pointed at the watch. "Does that detail look familiar to you?" Helen nodded. "Things like that don't show up by chance. That's an anchor, the link between memory and reality. If we find someone who owns a watch like that, we'll be staring into the center of her fear." When Emily left Helen's office, she sat in the car for a long time, hands resting on the wheel, eyes unfocused. In her mind, Ryan's image emerged again. That awkward smile, those eyes that never softened. And then she remembered Shadow's first reaction when Ryan entered Claire's room. Ears sharp, body tense, ready to block. Back then, Emily thought it was a protective instinct. Now she wasn't so sure. Shadow wasn't protecting by instinct. He was protecting from memory. At that same moment, back in the hospital, Claire was finishing a new drawing. This time, there were no people, just a dim backyard, scattered weeds and garbage, and a half-open cellar door. On the tiled ground near the entrance, a small black shape, a dog. No visible face, but the ears stood tall, and the eyes seemed to wait for someone to look back, remember, and speak a name. Claire laid down her brush, placed the paper aside, and turned toward Shadow, who rested with his head on the edge of her bed. For the first time, she spoke a whisper-like breath, "Shadow." And for the first time since he was found beside her in Oakwood Park, Shadow stood, padded softly to her, rested his head in her lap, and closed his eyes. As if to say, "I'm still here, I always have been, a living memory, and the one truth that had never been lost." The treatment room was still bathed in the gentle light of morning as Emily quietly stepped into the hallway, holding copies of Claire's drawings, each one a narrow doorway into a dark corner of memory she had never been able to voice. Under the soft yellow glow of the ceiling lights, Shadow walked beside her in complete silence, his steps light and measured, always close enough that she could feel him brush her hand when needed. Like a sentinel, not imposing, but always present. Just as they reached the ground floor, a phone notification flashed. "This is Marcus Riley, about Shadow. I need to talk." Emily froze. That name wasn't unfamiliar. She'd seen it on Shadow's chip registration. His former trainer, once a respected K-9 officer who had abruptly left the force after a non-disclosed incident. It seemed Shadow's past ran deeper than any report she'd ever held in her hands. She replied simply, "I'm listening." Seconds later, a video link arrived. A note beneath the title read, "The event that got him removed from the unit. Watch closely." Emily sat down on a bench in the hallway and opened the video with the guarded anticipation that someone who knows what they're about to see could change how they view someone forever. The footage was from a body camera worn by a trainer. The setting was a tactical training session in a simulated corridor. Smoke, mock gunfire, strobing lights, and shouted commands. Shadow, then not even 2 years old, was being tested in response to a hostage and attacker scenario. On command, he launched toward the designated target. But just as he was about to strike, he stopped cold. He had spotted something the humans hadn't noticed. In the shadows, a child, curled up, trembling. Not part of the drill, a real child. Emily guessed she was the daughter of a logistics staffer who had carelessly let her wander into the training zone. Without command, without hesitation, Shadow abandoned his target and approached the child. No barking, no alert. He simply lay beside her, gently licked her cheek, and curled around her like a warm shield. The video blurred just as the training alarm blared, and the angry voice of a commanding officer shouted, "He disobeyed! Pull him from duty immediately." Emily put the phone down, her heart pounding as if she had just witnessed something sacred trampled beneath cold regulation. In a world governed by commands and conditioned reflexes, Shadow had done what humans too often forget, to distinguish between obedience and kindness, and the price he paid for that compassion was banishment, branded as unreliable and erased like an error from a perfect record. Moments later, Marcus called. His voice was low and gravelly, like someone who had waited far too long to be heard. "I can't forget that day," he began, "because it was the day I realized a dog could have a bigger heart than many people in uniform." Emily said nothing. She listened like a student to a lesson on the true meaning of loyalty. "I wrote a full report afterward," he continued, "said that Shadow saved a child, and his actions deserved honor, not removal. But they didn't want to admit a K9 had broken protocol. They called him a failure. And I was suspended." "Did you try to find him?" Emily asked. "I did, but his records were locked. His name was erased, like they wanted him buried forever. I thought he was gone, until I saw that photo of him next to Claire on the news." Marcus paused. "He's not gone. He's still protecting. This time a woman. And I think she needs us to believe her." Emily looked down at Shadow, now lying at her feet. His eyes were closed, but his ears were still raised, like he knew something important was finally being brought into the light. "I need to meet you," Emily said. "Claire, she's started to draw. Each picture is a memory trying to break the surface, but only with Shadow there does she feel safe. I think he remembers what we don't yet understand." "I'll come," Marcus replied. "I'll bring everything I have. Original files, old reports, even the video clip that never made it into the official record. If I have to testify, I will, for Shadow, and for Claire." When the call ended, Emily didn't move for a while. Her chest was tight, part fury, part the weight of realizing this story was bigger than she'd feared. That night, as Claire quietly worked on a new drawing, this time of a man in uniform, standing apart from a dog who had turned away, sorrow in both their eyes, Shadow rose, walked over and rested his head gently on her hand. Claire smiled faintly, for the first time since waking. She whispered, "You remember everything, don't you?" And in that moment, it became clear. Some memories don't need words. Just an honest gaze, and a dog who never turned away from kindness. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the frosted glass of the therapy room, Claire had fallen asleep on the couch, one slender arm loosely wrapped around Shadow's neck. He lay still, unmoving, as though each of her breaths guided his calm. Emily, sitting a few feet away, noticed his ears twitch the moment footsteps echoed down the hall. No barking, no growling, just a sharp turn of his head, eyes fixed on the approaching figure, more alert than any seasoned security officer. The man approaching was a police officer. Tall, with cropped salt and pepper hair, and eyes that held not just fatigue, but a deeper weariness, regret. He wore no formal uniform, just a simple leather jacket and a badge clipped to his belt. He stopped at the door and nodded gently at Emily, careful not to disturb Claire's sleep. "Travis Morgan," he said quietly. "I've been assigned temporarily, replacing the former chief. I also worked alongside Marcus Reilly." Emily rose, slightly stunned. She had heard Marcus mention a former partner, one who'd worked child rescue cases, a man who'd lost something unspoken in a file with no conclusion. And now he stood before her, part of the tangled mystery she was trying to unravel. Travis crouched and cautiously extended a hand toward Shadow. "If you're Shadow, you'll remember me. I saw you clear the spiral staircase drill. No K9 had done it before. I never forgot." Shadow stared at him. No retreat, no leap forward. He studied Travis, then slowly circled behind him, finally resting his head gently against the man's back, as if acknowledging a familiar past. It wasn't a random gesture. It was recognition, reassembling a shared memory with someone who hadn't just commanded but had once listened. Emily smiled faintly. "Looks like he accepts you. At least Shadow believes you belong here." They sat down in a small conference room. Travis laid an old, yellowed envelope on the table. Inside were reports and photographs, sealed under brittle plastic. He pulled out a photo. A girl, maybe 8, eyes swollen from crying, clutching a stuffed bear. Behind her was a blurred figure, redacted for anonymity. "That girl," Travis murmured, "was missing for 2 weeks. When we found her, she wouldn't speak. But the drawings she made, they were almost identical to Claire's." Emily glanced at the sketches, a chill crawling down her spine. Stone walls, chains, and one image stood out. A silver-faced watch, round, on the left wrist. The same watch Ryan always wore. "The case was never prosecuted," Travis continued, voice tightening. "The mother dropped charges. The suspect was cleared for lack of evidence. I missed my chance to bring the truth out." He paused, then pulled another photo, this time of Ryan Bennett at a family gathering. On his left wrist, unmistakably, that same silver watch. "You know I'll need more than a feeling," Emily said quietly. "And I know I have to start over," Travis replied. "You're not the only one uneasy about Ryan. But now we have Shadow, we have Claire, and I won't let what happened to that girl happen again." Shadow stood, walked over to the table, and gently nudged the photo toward Emily with his nose. Not a trick. A message. Emily met his gaze. His eyes needed no words. They carried the quiet truth. The evidence is here, but someone must have the courage to face it. That evening, as Emily left the hospital, Travis walked beside her to the parking lot. Shadow trailed faithfully on her left like an old friend returned after a long, undeserved exile. Before parting ways, Travis said softly, like a vow, "He chose to trust me, and this time, I won't let him down." Shadow lifted his head and let out a low, quiet sound. Not a growl, a sigh. As if, after all the years of being dismissed, forgotten, and labeled a failure, he was finally allowed to follow his truest instinct again. To protect, to lead, and to bring the truth home for those who had stayed silent far too long. Morning sunlight filtered softly through the white curtains, casting faint beams across the hospital floor. In room 217, the air still carried the sharp scent of antiseptic and the chill of the air conditioner. Claire lay there, her figure small beneath the white layers of sheets, hair tangled across the pillow, eyes barely open, as if she hadn't yet decided whether she was awake or still trapped in a nightmare that had lasted for years. Across from her bed, Shadow sat in absolute silence, like a living statue. The German Shepherd, once branded insubordinate by the K9 program, was now the only being capable of calming Claire when someone approached. He didn't bark, didn't demand attention. He simply existed, quietly, completely, as if he understood that just being there, in the right place at the right time, he was doing what no one else could, making sure she no longer felt alone. The door creaked open softly. Amanda stepped in with quiet footsteps, as though afraid of disturbing something fragile. In her hand was a neatly wrapped fruit basket, the crinkling of plastic unnervingly loud. She smiled at Claire, trying to inject some sense of normalcy into the air. "Sweetheart, I brought your favorite, fresh strawberries and butter cookies," Amanda said, avoiding her daughter's averted eyes. "They say you're getting better. That makes me so happy." Claire didn't respond. She kept staring at the ceiling, hands clutching the blanket. Then a deeper voice came from the doorway. "I thought maybe if Claire sees me, it might bring back something positive." Ryan stepped into the room, tall, composed in a gray coat, hair neatly parted, and the familiar silver watch glinting beneath his cuff. To an outsider, he still looked the part. Polite, measured, warm-eyed, the ideal stepfather. But to Shadow, the air shifted instantly. The moment Ryan crossed the threshold, Shadow sprang up. No bark, no snarl, just a tensing of muscles, shoulders raised, ears sharp, and an unwavering stare locked onto the man, precise, alert, and full of intent. Ryan took a few more steps, smiling. "Hi, Claire, sweetheart," he said, leaning down to rest a hand on the bed rail. That's when Shadow growled. Low, deep, quiet, but clean as a blade slicing into the thick tension of the room. "What's wrong with him?" Amanda flinched, pulling Ryan's arm back. "Probably just agitated by a stranger's scent." Ryan shrugged, still smiling, though his hand withdrew. But Shadow didn't move. He held his ground between Claire and Ryan, a living wall no one could breach. Then Claire turned her head. Not suddenly, not abruptly, but her eyes, for the first time since waking, weren't blank or distant. They were fixed on a point behind Ryan, as though piercing through him. Her lips trembled, her eyes widened, her body curled in on itself, as if flung backward into a place where darkness had no exits. And then, as though shards of memory collided and broke open inside her, she gasped out the first words from deep in her throat, hoarse, trembling, but clear as a bell dragged up from the depths of time. "Don't lock me in!" Emily, waiting in the hallway, burst in. Amanda stood stunned. Ryan's face went pale. Claire's breathing turned erratic, tears streaming unchecked, her body shaking violently, as though those 4 words had pulled her back into a wooden cell beneath the earth, where no one had heard her call. Shadow whined softly and placed his front legs on the bed. He pressed his body against Claire's, nose brushing her hand, tail tucked low, eyes gentle. No training, no command, just instinct. He knew she needed to be pulled back from the edge, from the void that Ryan's presence had reopened. Travis arrived as soon as he got the call. He entered just as Claire was starting to calm, wrapped in Emily's arms, Shadow still lying pressed beside her. He didn't speak. He just stared at Ryan, his gaze lingering on the silver watch, then turned to Emily. A single, subtle nod passed between them. This wasn't just about an emotionally unstable girl anymore. This was a warning shot, and the most undeniable sign yet that something terrible had been buried. Ryan left the room, attempting to maintain composure, but even after the door shut behind him, Shadow remained at the bedside. He didn't move an inch. He didn't need orders. He didn't need praise. But in every breath, every look, every still posture, he had assumed the role no one gave him, keeper of memory and guardian of the truth finally beginning to surface. Once Claire had calmed, she reached out and touched Shadow's ear, a soft, barely there gesture. But Shadow tilted his head and lowered his eyes as if to say, "You've found your anchor. It will never betray you." And this was only the beginning. By the time the first light of morning brushed the hospital windows, Travis was already waiting outside. Claire's painful awakening, paired with Shadow's instinctive reaction, hadn't just triggered buried memories. It had ignited a sense of urgency. This wasn't a vague hunch anymore. Something had happened in Ryan's house. And now Travis needed proof. Emily arrived hurriedly, temporary investigation documents in hand. "I got civil support authorization," she said. "We can't enter outright, but if we find signs of abuse or endangerment, the Chief of Police can invoke Regulation 14B for emergency inspection." Travis nodded. "We don't have time." He knows Claire spoke. They headed to the quiet, suburban neighborhood where Ryan and Amanda lived. The garden was immaculate, the lawn perfectly trimmed, like a home lifted from a catalog. But that pristine facade made Travis even more suspicious. In his experience, the more manicured the surface, the more carefully hidden the rot beneath. They circled to the rear, where a row of low shrubs bordered a stretch of old brick, the only remnant of the original house blueprint Marcus had shown them the night before. Travis pried open a small kitchen window and slipped inside, Emily close behind. The air was thick with dampness, old and stale. Amanda had been escorted out earlier under the pretense of a welfare hearing. Ryan, according to her, was off on a weekend hunting trip in an undisclosed location. Emily peeled back a small rug near the side staircase. Beneath it was a tiled floor, unremarkable, save for a faint L-shaped crack, nearly worn flat. But Travis, a seasoned investigator that he was, knew not all doors had handles. He tapped along the tiles with a metal rod, until, on the third corner, the sound turned hollow. They inhaled in unison as Travis pried up a loose tile, revealing a hidden handle embedded beneath. A trap door. They pulled it open to reveal stairs descending into a basement, a level never marked on the current blueprints. No lights, no smell of blood, but the air was colder than normal, the suffocating kind of cold that came from a space sealed for months but never truly abandoned. Travis went first, flashlight at the ready, his sidearm holstered but within reach. Emily followed, scanning the walls with thermal imaging. Every inch mattered. At the base of the stairs, what they saw was worse than blood. The walls were lined with acoustic foam. Amateur, but effective. Not for storing tools, not for wine, but for hiding sound. On the concrete floor, a semicircular dent had been patched over with mismatched cement. Cracks still bled from the repair. Emily's flashlight swept upward, catching a small rusted hook in the ceiling. Not fresh, but unmistakably used. Its shape still bore the weight of something once hung there. No words were needed. Each detail spoke louder than any confession. Claire had been held here, in silence, in the dark, with no help coming. In a far corner, Travis knelt and retrieved a piece of silk, yellowed but still faintly scented, jammed into the brickwork, hidden, or perhaps forgotten. "This is enough to bring him in," Travis said, eyes still fixed on the ceiling hook. He called for forensics and ordered the property sealed. Hours later, Ryan was summoned under emergency procedure. When he walked into the interrogation room, his face showed no fear, only irritation, as though this were an inconvenient blip in his weekend plans. But Travis, for the first time in years, felt no hesitation. Back at the hospital, Claire still lay motionless, wrapped in silence. Shadow remained by her bedside, guarding every breath as if keeping her tethered to safety. Emily came in and placed a hand gently on Shadow's head. "You led us here," she whispered, eyes meeting his, not as a handler, but as a teammate. "And now it's our turn to finish what you started." Shadow lifted his head, eyes dark and deep as still water. No bark. He didn't need one, because now Claire was no longer alone. The sky had yet to fully brighten when the vehicle carrying Claire rolled away from the protected facility. The city was frozen in the early morning mist, as if even the air itself were holding its breath, bracing for something important. Inside the vehicle, Claire sat still, her eyes tracing the blur of trees through the foggy window. Beside her, Shadow lay with his head resting on her leg, his breathing steady, like a quiet rhythm anchoring a soul still finding its way. Emily sat in the front seat, not turning around, but watching Claire closely through the rearview mirror. She knew today was a turning point. Not because the court would render any final judgment, but because Claire would be speaking, for the first time, in her voice, to the world. The court convened an emergency hearing. No press, no noise, but all the essential people were present. The prosecutor, Claire's attorney, police representatives, and most notably, Ryan, her stepfather, sitting across the room, fingers intertwined, eyes unreadable, occasionally casting glances at Claire as if all of this were just one big misunderstanding. Claire entered the courtroom with her shoulders slightly hunched beneath a light brown coat. She paused before sitting. Only when Shadow stepped in behind her, lifting his head to scan the room, did she exhale softly and take her seat on the witness stand. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired but sharp eyes. She didn't speak much, just summarized the reason for the emergency hearing and invited Claire to speak. Not to testify, but to express what she wanted. The room turned to stone. Claire didn't look at anyone. Her eyes hovered somewhere mid-air, then dropped to the floor, where Shadow lay with his head between his paws, eyes upturned, waiting patiently, offering presence, not pressure. Claire's hand gripped the hem of her coat, then released it. Her voice was barely audible, but everyone lifted their heads. She swallowed and spoke again, this time clearer. I don't want to go back to that house. Not a sound followed. Even the court reporter paused as if to make sure she heard it right. I know this might seem sudden, but I need people to believe me, even if I can't say everything, Claire continued, still not looking at Ryan or the judge, only at Shadow, as if speaking to herself through the eyes of the dog who had never left her side. That place is not safe, not just because of what happened recently, but because, long before that, I was a child who wanted to disappear inside my own home, and I don't want to be locked inside those memories again. Her voice did not tremble. She didn't cry, but every word carried the weight of years spent imprisoned by invisible control. Freedom so false, it slowly erased who she was. Ryan shifted in his chair, about to speak, but the low, sharp growl from Shadow stopped him cold. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was a warning, a visceral read of Claire's rising heart rate and the invisible intrusion into her space. Police officers approached Ryan, one placing a hand gently on his shoulder in silent caution. Ryan clenched his jaw, eyes darkening, but said nothing. The judge nodded slowly. Ms. Bennett, thank you for speaking. Sometimes just one sentence is enough to be taken seriously. After a brief deliberation, the court declared, an emergency no-contact order is granted. Claire Bennett will be relocated to a secure residence under the supervision of the Witness Protection Agency and mental health professionals. Ryan Bennett is prohibited from all contact, in any form, until the full trial is convened. Emily closed her eyes for a second as the ruling was read, then turned and smiled gently at Claire, the girl who had just crossed a threshold many never managed to reach. Claire didn't smile back, but she leaned down and placed her hand on Shadow's head, her fingers lightly brushing over his soft ear. Not a pet, but a quiet thank you, rich with meaning. As they exited the courtroom, passing Ryan's row, Shadow stepped between Claire and her stepfather. He didn't bark, didn't growl, he just stood. His gaze met Ryan's with a message that needed no words. Your era of control ends here. As the car wound through the low mountains and left the city behind, the lights gradually faded from view. Claire sat quietly in the back seat, a thick blanket draped over her narrow shoulders. She didn't ask where they were going. She didn't protest. Her silence was no longer fear. It was the long, weary exhale after a storm. Someone too tired to be afraid, simply wanting to drift. Beside her, Shadow sat upright, eyes scanning the roadside, ears twitching now and then at unseen movements in the dark. The lakeside cabin at Lake Champlain had been chosen for the first stage of Claire's protection. Hidden deep within a forest of changing maple leaves, the little wooden house looked like a memory from a gentler time. Old mossy shingles, a creaky wooden porch, and a gray stone fireplace. The scent of pine, damp soil, and fresh water filled the air with a vague sense of safety, as if time itself slowed in this place. When the car stopped at the edge of the gravel path, Shadow was the first to step out. Not in haste, but with deliberate calm. He sniffed the air thoroughly, ears up, scanning for threats. Emily opened the rear door and helped Claire out. Claire said nothing, but her eyes moved around. Tall trees, the silent lake, no signs of people. Everything seemed to whisper a promise of peace. Shadow turned just as Claire reached the porch, and their eyes met in a quiet exchange. This place is far enough. You can breathe here. That first night in the cabin, no one went to bed early. Claire sat by the fireplace, a blanket across her legs, rubbing her hands together to keep warm. Emily busied herself in the tiny kitchen, boiling water and preparing a small meal. At Claire's feet, Shadow curled into a ball, eyes wide open, watchful. Not like a pet, but like a guardian stationed at the border between safety and the past, trying to break through. When the fireplace glowed warm and steady, the flickering light danced across the wooden walls like shadows slipping through. Claire stared into the flames, then closed her eyes. She was trying to grasp something. A memory, a sound, or perhaps just the warmth filling the hollowness in her chest. Outside, the forest had gone still. The wind rustled faintly through the leaves, the kind of sound you only notice when the world is quiet enough to remember it's alive. Claire went to bed earlier than usual. She entered the small back bedroom, window facing the lake. The moon was unusually bright that night, casting a soft glow across the water. She climbed into bed and pulled the blanket to her chin. Shadow had already entered. He leaped onto the mattress without needing to be called. He lay down beside her, not pressing his head against her, just letting one side of his body touch hers, just close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath, steady and real, a living clock, ticking down nightmares. The night passed slowly, as if time were walking softly across the creaky floorboards. Claire dreamed. In the dream, she was running, toward something or away from something she didn't know. There were dark walls, dim lights, someone's hand grabbing hers from behind, frantic breathing in her ear. Her heart pounded so hard that the dream became noise. She screamed, but the dream didn't fade. Then, something warm touched her hand. Light, so light, she jolted upright. Moonlight shone through the window. Beside her, Shadow was there, resting his nose on her hand, his eyes full of understanding. No bark, no panic, just presence. Claire met his gaze, and a tear slid silently down her cheek. Not from fear, but from knowing she wasn't alone. The next morning, Emily woke later than usual. She stepped onto the porch and found Claire already there. A cup of tea in hand, hair still messy, face softened by something quiet. Like someone returned from a long, long dream. Shadow lay at her feet, head resting on her slippers. Morning sunlight brushed his gray fur like a veil of light. "Did you sleep last night?" Emily asked gently. Claire nodded. Then, after a pause, as if choosing each word from a fragile, hidden place, she whispered, "I dreamed." But this time, Shadow was there. Nothing more needed to be said. In that quiet statement was a thank you, a beginning, and a quiet miracle. Sometimes a creature who cannot speak hears the smallest cries of a soul trying to survive. The atmosphere at the lakeside cabin on Lake Champlain seemed still, but something was subtly shifting in the smallest of details. A leaf lingering longer than usual on its branch, seagulls flying lower across the water, and shadows barking. Not loud, not persistent, but timed just right, like a silent alarm sounding only for those truly listening. Claire began to realize it wasn't a coincidence. From the third morning at the cabin, Shadow started behaving differently. He no longer asked to go far into the woods, but would often stop at a particular spot, with a view of the trail that led down behind the lake. Each time he would stand still for a few minutes, sniff the air, and then turn back, his eyes fixed on something invisible between the trees. Claire noticed but didn't ask. She still kept her habit of staying quiet, letting feelings speak instead. And those feelings were becoming sharper, like a sixth sense awakened. That afternoon, when Emily returned from town with some supplies, she sensed something was off the moment she parked. Fresh tire tracks imprinted on the damp earth, not matching hers or Travis's. She called Travis immediately. Less than an hour later, the sheriff showed up with a compact drone and a thermal camera. He, Shadow, and Claire swept the area around the cabin. Under the drone's lens, a dark SUV appeared clearly in the blurry heat signature, parked about 200 meters away behind a stand of maple trees. The engine was running. Lights off. Waiting. Quietly. Deliberately. Travis gritted his teeth and said under his breath, "He's not just watching. He's measuring our reactions." Shadow stood beside Claire, the fur on his back raised. A low, deep growl came from his throat. Not fear, but alertness. And maybe a simmering rage. By the time they moved in to check, the SUV was gone. But it wasn't the disappearance of the vehicle that made Travis frown. It was what had been left behind. A length of rusty metal chain, placed right under a tree near the cabin, with one end hooked and bent, as if it had once been violently yanked. Claire saw the chain, and instinctively stepped back. She said nothing, but her shoulders trembled. Shadow immediately stepped forward, placing himself between her and the object, not barking, not reacting beyond what was necessary, just